Hey guys, my name is Smeef. I'm a 3D artist with over 4 years of experience creating, and in this Skillshare class I'm going to be teaching you the very basics of product rendering. For this project we're going to be walking through the creation of this Red Bull can. We'll be walking through modeling, texturing, lighting, and of course rendering. To finish everything off, we'll do a quick composite and color grade in DaVinci Resolve, and from there you'll have an amazing product render to show to your friends and family. I've included all of the resources in the projects and resources below. If you do have any questions, please feel free to post a comment below. And with all of that said, I hope to see you in the next lesson where we start our journey with modeling. Alright, let's jump straight into creating this thing. So we're just going to start off with a general blend file, and immediately I'm just going to delete everything, get rid of it all. And we're just going to start off by working on a little bit of scene management. So up here in the outliner, I'm just going to create a new collection by right clicking and hitting new collection. You just click on your collection and double click that. You can just rename that to whatever you'd like. In this instance, I'm just going to rename this Red Bull can. I'm also going to come up here and click on this filter toggles button, and we're just going to enable selection and also display. So basically now we can disable things in the viewport, make them non-selectable and selectable, and that's just going to help us with our workflow. So now let's just get straight into creating this Red Bull can, and then we'll move on to all the other aspects of this Skillshare class. So first up, let's just press Shift A and grab a cylinder. So before we even begin modeling, we're just going to need to import some reference images. So if we just go Shift A, come down to Image and Reference, you can then navigate to your reference images and just select them both. So just select those ones and load them in. Depending on how you're looking at your viewport, it's going to load in basically the point at which you're viewing it. So what we want to do is just select both of these and hit Alt-R to reset the rotation. And from there we can then just start setting up the reference images to our liking. So let's just grab this one here. I'm going to rotate it on the X-axis up, and then on the Z-axis 90 degrees as well. And then I'm just going to pull it up to about the middle point here, like so. I'm just going to load in the top of the can as well. So Shift A, Image, Reference, and then I'll load in Red Bull can top. There we go. Again, it's loaded in the way that I'm looking at the screen, at the viewport. So I'll just fix that rotation and bring that up. Right now you don't really have to worry about the scale. We'll fix that once we model the Red Bull can. So I'm just going to roughly size it down to the size of the can's top. And for now, I'm just going to come up here to the outliner and make the top of the can non-selectable and also hidden from my view. So now we can just work with this, with the reference image of the Red Bull can. So if we switch to orthographic view, we can now start the modeling process for this can. So let's go Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder, and let's just start modeling this guy out. So tab into edit mode, and let's just scale this roughly to the size of the can here. That's looking pretty good. To actually see what we're doing, I'm going to press Alt and Z, and that's going to enable X-ray mode. So now we can actually start doing our basic modeling of the can. I'm just going to line it up to the very top and also at the bottom. Line that to the very bottom. And now we can just start fleshing it out by adding in loop cuts and going from there. So first off, let's just add in 2 loop cuts. I'm just going to scale it on the Z axis and push them out closer to the top and the bottom. And now I'm going to select this loop here, bring that up right to where it starts to go in here. And I'm actually seeing already that this can is a little bit too big, so I'm going to select everything with A, hit S to scale, Shift and Z to only scale on the X and Y axis, and then I'm just going to pull that in, just like that. There we go. So now we can start with the top and the bottom of the can, which is basically where most of the detail is. So I'm going to grab this loop here, I'm going to press G twice on the keyboard to slide it, and then while holding Shift I can move it more precisely down to the bottom here where we start to get that first change in form. So now I'm just going to add in another loop cut here, scale that in without Z, so Shift Z, that'll do X and Y. There we go. I'll now just grab the bottom here, do the same thing, Shift and Z, and we can scale that in. Now you'll notice the image here, it's not completely symmetrical, so there will be a tiny bit of guesswork, but overall it's going to look basically the same. So bottom for now is pretty good. I'm just going to go up to the top here, and I'm just going to flesh this part out now. So with Control R, I'm just going to add in another loop cut, scale that in, Shift Z, make that look nice, and then the very top here I'm going to scale that in as well, Shift Z, there we go. So now we need to make this a bit of a lip here to the can. So what I'll do is go Control R, make another loop cut, scale that out just a tiny bit, there we go. And now I'm just going to bevel that. So Control B to bevel. If you want to add more resolution, you can scroll on your mouse wheel. I'd say about 3 loop cuts will do. And for this one, you can see it comes in fairly sharp here, so I'm just going to scale that in with Shift and Z. And now we can just move that up on the Z axis, and we've got a fairly decent looking cap there to the top. So that's the basics of the can. It's a very easy model, thankfully. You can see it's super basic. Right now it's looking kind of jagged, and that's because we haven't shade smoothed. So if we just go right click shade smooth, it's looking a little better, but you can see there's some weird artifacts from the shading. So if you come over here to the object data properties tab, you can just come down to the normals and hit auto smooth, and that's immediately just going to fix all of those artifacts. Great, so now we've got the can basically set up. We need to move on to the top of the can soon, but there's just a few more things I want to do before I move on, which is mainly tabbing back into edit mode here. I'm just going to Alt Z back into X-ray vision, and I'm just going to add in a little bit more curvature here at the bottom. So I'm going to Alt click this loop cut here, Control B to bevel, and I'm just going to bring that down just a tad, and there we go, that's looking much nicer. So now moving out of orthographic view, I'm just going to move down to the bottom here to go back into solid mode by pressing Alt and Z, and I'm going to switch through the different selection modes here. So we've got 3 to go to face selection, 2 for edge selection, and 1 for vertice selection. So on 3, we're just going to select this whole face here, and we're going to inset that by pressing I. So inset that in a bit, and then we're just going to make that concave shape underneath the can. So super simple to do. Once you've inset that here, we can just hit E to extrude, and then S to scale, and from there we can just push it up. So G to move, and then Z to push up, and there we go, we've basically got the bottom of the can set. So I'm just going to come back to edge select mode here by pressing 2, select this edge, and Alt Shift click the inner edge as well, and now I'm going to bevel that. So Control B to bevel. If you want to clamp it so it doesn't go on forever like this, you can press C, and that'll just clamp it to its maximum range. Totally up to you. I'm just going to do a tiny bevel here and not fully completed. There we go. So that's basically the can complete. If you want to add more detail on the bottom, you're more than welcome to, but we're very rarely going to see the bottom of the can, if at all. If you're not going to see it, you may as well not waste time on it. So let's just go now to the top view by pressing 7, now numpad. And from here, we can actually come up to the outliner and view the can top again. And from here, this is where we can actually start scaling it in and sort of roughly getting it to that size of the can. So first off, it's a little bit difficult to see as there's no opacity on the image and we can't really look through it. So best way I've found, first off, let's get rid of this here. So this reference image, you can just click it and press H to hide it. And now if we click on this image here, we can just bring that down below the surface. And if we go back up to 7 on the numpad and go back to orthographic view from the top, we can click on our can here and do Alt Z. and that basically makes it visible to the eye, which is great. So now what we want to do is actually create the lid of the can, basically. So we want to make this tab here. We want to make the indents of the top of the lid. But before we do that, we actually have to model this top bit. So let's first click on the reference image and just scale that until we see it overlapping with one another, like that. Awesome. Now from the top view, I'm just going to select the can, tab into edit mode, go to face selection, and now we can actually start insetting and creating that little lip and the depth on the top of the can. So let's go I to inset, bring that in just a bit. Then I'm going to do E to extrude and S to scale, bring that in a tad bit more, and then I'm just going to bring that down. So G and Z, bring that down a bit, and already you can see it's looking more like a can. So I'm just going to go into edge select mode here and bevel these edges just a bit. So I'm going to select both these edges here. So I'm alt clicking that edge, and then I'll alt shift click the outer edge as well. Control B and bevel. Awesome. So now from the top view, by pressing 7 on your numpad, I'm just going to go to X-ray vision here, and I'm just going to start roughly lining up the inner circle here to the actual can tab. So somewhere like here seems pretty good. It encompasses most of the can's lid here, so that's looking good. I'm actually just going to add in a loop cut here by pressing Ctrl R, and I'm just going to scale that, Shift Z scale that in a bit, just to give it a bit more of a crisp outline on the edge here. So with that done, I'm just going to add in maybe one more, and I'm going to bring that down. So G and Z, just to give it a bit more of a lip at the top there. And now let's move on to creating the tab, or the top of the can. So by pressing 3, we're going to select this top face here. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate that. So now we have a separate face here. And basically what we want to do is separate this selected face from the can itself, so that we have its own separate object. So easiest way to do that is pressing P, and then we can do separate by selection. So hit that selection button. Now you can see we've got cylinder 1, which is our can, and cylinder 001, which is the lid. So super quickly while we're here, we may as well name our objects. So cylinder, we can press F2 on the keyboard to quickly rename something. And now we can just rename this Red Bull can. And then cylinder 001 is the lid. So I'm just going to press F2 and call that lid. One more thing before we move on, I can see that we don't actually have these objects in the Red Bull can collection. So what you can do is select everything here, press M on your keyboard. That allows you to move it to a collection. So we can click on Red Bull can, and now you can see everything is neatly tied away in that collection. So now back to the top of the can here, I'm just going to click on the lid, tab into edit mode, Alt Z for X-ray vision, and now we can start creating this unique shape on the top here. Alright, so the easiest way I've found to do this is by first off going to vertice mode, so you can see what you're working with. And all I'm going to do is press A to select everything. I'm going to inset this just slightly until we get this shape down the bottom, roughly matching. So from there, we want to start pulling in all these vertices to match up to this, and then we'll just go from there. So let's just begin by selecting these two vertices here. And the quickest way I found to do it in unison and to make it basically mirrored, you can hit S and then Shift and Z, and basically just pull these vertices in to where you would like them to be. So now I'm just going to speed through this process of lining it all up, and I'll see you once I've completed that. Alright, so now we've got a very basic sort of outline of the details that we're going to be creating. So now we want to actually fill in this middle section here. So all we have to do for that is just to pull out the knife tool. So you can either come down here and click on the knife tool, or you can just press K on your keyboard and you can start drawing out some topology. So what I'm going to do is just click on a vertice, click on the other vertice, it should snap to it. Once you've done clicking, you'll see it continues, and you basically, to accept it, all you have to do is press enter and that'll create the topology for you. So I'm just going to fill out the rest of this here. Now to create the lid, or basically the part where the fluid comes out of, all we really need to do is go to face select mode, select on that face, and we're just going to inset that. So we'll make the basic shape and move it up as needed. I can see now actually that we don't need this edge here, so I'm actually just going to Control Z, and I'm just going to select this edge here, press X to delete, and I'm actually just going to dissolve the edges. So that's going to dissolve it without actually deleting the topology. So now back to face select mode, I'm going to select that face, inset that in, and that's a much better line up there. So now with vertice mode we can just start lining things up. So first off, these two I can see have overlapped, so I'm just going to move them back and scale them in. There we go. And I mean, these have matched up pretty well, so I'm just going to leave them as is for now. But the topology here, there's not much to mess around with. So what I'm going to do is go back to the knife tool, and I'm just going to draw in that topology. There we go. So now what we can do, you can just go back to box select mode, and you can just start moving these down into position. Alright, wonderful. So that's a pretty decent outline of the tab there. But now what we're going to need to do is add in a few loops just around the center of it. So basically, if you hit Control R, add in a loop cut here. I'm just going to scale that in. So if we come out of edit mode, you can see there's actually some weird wobbling effects going on. That's because we haven't actually deleted the lid of this can. So what I'm going to do quickly is just go back to the can, go back to the lid, hide that by pressing H on the keyboard, come back to the can, go into edit mode, and I'm just going to delete this face here. So with face selection enabled, I'm just going to select that face, press X, and delete the face. There we go. So back out of edit mode, if you just press Alt and H, that'll unhide everything. I'm just going to hide that reference image again. And now we can see we've got a face with no detailing. Okay, so now we just need to inset this face one more time, and then this initial outline that we created is going to actually make that beveled edge that pops out from the can. So let's go I to inset, pull that in just a tad, and now with edge select enabled, we're just going to select this edge. It's a little bit more easy to see in solid view. I'm going to select this edge, press G and Z to move that up, and basically we now have that indentation detailing that you see on the can. So we're not done there, we also have to do this one here, and we'll just leave it as those two very basic shapes. So let's actually make a selection here around the edges. So select all of this here, and I'm actually just going to scale it in very slightly, just so it matches up a tiny bit better with the edge there. And then I'm going to add in a loop cut around the outside of it. Now last step here is I'm just going to add in one more loop cut, and that's just going to be right here. So I'm going to scale that in ever so slightly, and now we have a loop that we can basically select down here, all the way to here, and pull up from the can to give it that detailing. Let's just start off by selecting the entire edge loop, and from there I'm just going to control drag and unselect these top few at the very top, like so. So now we just have the loop here that we actually want to manipulate. So from there I'm just going to go into solid view and pull that up just like we did with the opening of the can. There we go. So now we have a very basic low poly version of those details that actually make this look real and good. Easiest way to do that is to just add in a subdivision modifier. So if you come over here to the modifiers tab, come down to subdivision surface, you can add that in. So immediately it's looking a lot better, but it's very smooth and it's a little bit hard to actually see the work that you've just created. So if you tab back into edit mode, you can actually just bevel the edges, and that will help make it stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going to, with what we had selected before, I'm going to press Ctrl B and bevel that just slightly. Then I'm also going to alt click this loop here, Ctrl B that, and just bevel that a tiny bit more. And now we have way better detailing on the top of our can, which is awesome. Great, so now we can actually move on to creating the tab that opens the can, as well as this little circle in the middle. These ones are super easy to create, so let's just jump straight into that. So first off, let's go Shift A, Mesh, and Cylinder. I'm just going to bring that up to the top here, scale that in. I'm just going to go to solid mode now, just so it's a little bit more easier to see. And we're basically just making that little tab up the top, so I'm just scaling it to size. And if we go back to edit mode and just see what we're working with, that looks a lot more like the pin that holds the tab in. But we need to make it a bit more smoother and aesthetic. So easiest way to do that is adding another subdivision surface modifier to this guy. So a quick way to do that is just by pressing Ctrl 1. And then if you just press Shade Smooth, so right click Shade Smooth, it's looking a lot nicer and a lot more like the pin on top of the can. But we're not done yet, because you can see we've got these weird wobbling artifacts on the pin. So what you can do is jump into edit mode and just add in a couple loop cuts around the sides. So what you can do is just to tap into edit mode, you can add in 2 loop cuts on the side here, like so. And then if you just scale it out just a tad, and also scale it up on the Z axis, so S and Z, like so, you can see already that that's looking a lot smoother and a lot nicer. Great, so we'll leave that for now and we'll move on to creating the tab now. So it's fairly simple, all we really need is a cylinder to get started. So we'll go Shift A, cylinder, bring that up here, scale it down to roughly the size of basically the inner circle of the tab. So I'm going to scale that in until it reaches around that size. That seems pretty good. And now back in solid view, we're just going to go through to edit mode, go to face select, and we basically want to select every face except for this top one. So if you go into X-ray vision with Alt and Z, it's much easier to select all the faces, and then you can just hit X to delete faces. So now we have this singular face, we can get to work with the vertices. So I'm just going to go back to the top view mode here, and what I'm going to do is select all of them and inset them ever so slightly, like so. And now I'm going to select the outer rim and scale that out until it reaches basically the top and bottom of this section here, so the top of the tab and also just this bottom part here where it cuts out. So from there, the last thing to do before we can actually start modeling it is to delete the inner face, because there's no face in the actual tab. So I'm going to go X, delete faces, and now we can start scaling out these vertices until they roughly match the outline of the tab here. So I'm just going to speed through that now, and I'll see you in a bit. Alright, we've got the rough shape down here, and now that we're down at the bottom, I'm just going to select all of these vertices here, and I'm going to scale them on the y-axis to 0 so that they level out. So you press S, and then Y, and then 0, you can see that it's just basically leveled them out, and now we can manipulate it a little bit better. So I'm going to pull them down here, I'm going to grab these outer ones, scale them out to the sides, and also with these two I'm also going to scale them out a little bit. And now from here I'm just going to extrude these two edges down to make these two planes. So E and then Y, we're going to pull that down to here, and then once more E and Y, pull that down to here, and then I'm going to select this edge and this edge. I'm going to press F3, and you can see I've already searched it, bridge edge loops. So if you just type in bridge edge loops, you can see that that connects the two there, and we can continue extruding down here. So shift click all these edges here, E to extrude, Y to go down, and we just have to create a little bit more topology to really match the edges here. So back into vertice select mode, I'm going to select these two vertices, bring them up so it matches a bit better, and then in the middle here I'm going to Control R and create a few loop cuts, like so. And I'm just going to start refining that shape. There we go. So to actually finish this off, we're going to give it a bit of depth and thickness. So if we select everything with A, hit E to extrude, and press Z twice to go up, we can just give it some thickness here, so that should do. Make it as thick as you want, and then from there we basically want to bevel the edges. Let's just select all of the edges that we want to bevel, which is everything on the inside as well as the outside. So I'm selecting all edges now just by doing Alt Shift click. So now with everything selected, I'm just going to Control B to bevel that, and something like that looks pretty good. So we're not done yet. First off, we can right click and shade smooth. That immediately helps us out. And then also we can hit Control and 1 to add on a subdivision surface modifier. And from there, I mean, it looks much better than before. So I'm just going to pull that down to match the can's top, like so. And there we have it. We have the very basic top of the can. So if you like, you can increase the subdivision surface modifier to have more in the render just by playing with this slider here. I tend to find 4 is generally a good spot to put it. And so now we can actually move on to UV unwrapping and texturing this thing. Okay, so now to texture this can that we've created, we're going to go through basic UV unwrapping and material creation, and from there we'll move on to the lighting and the scene setup, and then actually get into the gist of all the product rendering tricks and techniques to really elevate your product rendering skill set. So first, let's go over to the UV editing layout, and from here we can first off tab out of edit mode and hide this reference image, and then with selecting the can here, I'm going to tab back into edit mode, and we can start creating some seams for our UV unwrap to follow. So if you look at the Red Bull can reference image very quickly, you'll see that the texture goes all the way to the top, just where the lip begins to flow over, and it goes all the way to the bottom, basically to about this section. So what we're going to do is mimic that. So if we hide that here, come back to our bottle, come back to our can, tab into it, we can start creating seams. So if you just click the edge loop there, come up to the top and we'll just zoom in, Alt-Shift-click the edge loop underneath the lip. We can then create seams for the texture to unwrap around. So if we right click and mark the seam, you'll see that even when we click off of this now, we have this red line around those edges that we've selected, and that's going to act as the seam, or the place where the UV texture is going to unwrap to. It'll make more sense once we actually do this. So now that we have the seam marked, we can go over to the shading editor, and from here we're just going to start creating these basic materials and get started on all the other materials like the aluminium. So let's start off with the can selected, hitting new to create a new material. Let's immediately call this one Red Bull Can, just to keep our scene a little bit more tidy. And from here you can either Shift A and search image texture and then navigate that way, or you can simply find your image and drag it in like that. Now from here I am going to be using the Node Wrangler workflow, so if you haven't already got that enabled, I'd suggest coming up to your Preferences tab, so Edit, Preferences, and then in your add-ons just search for Node Wrangler and just make sure that one is enabled. Okay, so from here with the Red Bull Can texture selected, you can hit Ctrl T. That's going to add in a few nodes here, so the texture coordinate node as well as the mapping node. So right now the texture coordinate is using the UVs, so I'm just going to drag the color over to the base color, give that a moment to load, and as you can see the unwrap of this can is nowhere to be seen, and it's all over the place. So what we need to do right now is go back to the UV editing. Okay, now that we have added that texture in, you can see it's over here in the UV editing workspace, and we basically need to unwrap all of these faces in the middle to match up to this texture. So before we do that, I'm just going to change this to material preview. That way we can actually see what we're working with. And as you can see, this is definitely not unwrapped and we need to get to work on this. So first off, I'm just going to select any one of these faces in the middle of the can, and we're going to use that as a base for all of the other faces. So let's select this one. I'm going to go right click, UV unwrap faces, unwrap, and you'll see that that's unwrapped the face and made it very uniform to the center here. So now that we've got that face unwrapped, with it still selected, I'm going to press Alt and Z to go into X-ray mode. I'm just going to go to the side view here with 3 on my numpad, and with Shift selected I'm going to box drag, box select basically all of the faces that I want this texture to be a part of. So everything up to that red line that we created earlier. Now that's all selected, you can see that we've got all of the faces over here, and we're missing this one in the middle that we initially unwrapped. So we basically want all of these faces here to follow the same unwrap method as this one that we selected earlier. So as you can see, it's still selected here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, and in the UV context menu we're going to click on Follow Active Quads. So the long and short of it is they now all have the same UV unwrap, and it's going to work much nicer when we're actually lining all of these quads up to this square here. So let's start doing that. I'm going to, with all of this selected, I'm just going to rotate it to the correct orientation, so it looks like this way is correct. So I'm just going to go 90. There we go. I'm going to bring that up here, and already you can see it's kind of coming together. So I'm going to scale it down and basically just match it up to the square here. Okay, so we're almost done. I'm just going to scale it up on the y-axis. And that's a pretty good unwrap there. So I'm going to leave it as is. And yeah, as you can see, we now have a very nice unwrap of the Red Bull can. So for all of the other bits of this can, like the top here and also the bottom, we're actually going to make that aluminium or sort of like a scratched metal texture. So we don't need to worry about that right now because we're going to assign a completely new material to it. So let's go back to the shading workspace, and from here we can actually start adding in a little bit more detail to the Red Bull can, but we'll also enable that metal material on the top and the bottom. So let's start off with the metal material. So to do so, we're just going to come over here to the slot menu, and I'm going to create another slot here and basically create a new material for it. So this is going to be called, so let's just call this one metal. And to actually apply it to the can where we want it to be applied to, we have to go into edit mode and basically select everything but this middle section where we've applied the Red Bull texture. So let's just start off by, at the bottom here, I'm going to Alt-Z for X-ray mode. I'm going to select everything up to that red line, and with that selected, I'm going to come down here to slot 2. I'm going to click Assign. And now you can see it's given the white material here, and if I was to change the color, you can see it's going to change on the fly. So that's pretty cool. Now for the top of the can, we're going to do the same process. Come up here, Alt-Z for X-ray mode. I'm just going to select everything like so. There we go. Come down to slot here, and then I'm going to assign that as well. So now you can see it's looking a lot nicer. Basically looking like the Red Bull can now. But I want to make this more of a metallic material. So first thing that we can do here is we can change the metallic to 1, which is going to basically make it metallic. And then from there, we can start playing with the base color. I found a sort of light gray works pretty well for this. That's looking a lot better already. So for the metal, basically you're just going to decrease the roughness so it's a little bit more shiny. And then I'm going to play with the color just a tad bit more. Something like that seems pretty good. And that's basically the metal material completed. So I'm going to mirror that onto the can, to the top of the lid, and also these other objects here. So now I'm just going to apply the metal material to all of these guys. So I'm just going to click on him, come down here and click on metal. And a quick way to just add the same material to these last 2 objects, you can just select them both and then shift select the metal material as the last material. Hit Ctrl L on your keyboard and you can link materials like so. There we go. So we've basically got the can created here, but we want to really improve this material here for the Red Bull texture. Right now it's very bland and it's not even metallic yet. So let's first off change the metallic to 1. That's immediately going to increase its look and make it feel more like a Red Bull can. But from there we can add in a few other cool textures and tricks to really sell that this is a real product. So first off, what we're going to do down here is we're going to add in a noise texture here. So Shift A, then we can search noise texture. Just going to plop that one down there. And if we move the factor into the roughness here, give it a second to load in, you can see it's basically adding in some noise to the material. And some of the parts are a bit more rougher than others, and it looks a little bit nicer. But we can definitely improve it. So what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to move this out of the way and link this vector to the vector here. There we go. And then from there, I'm just going to add in an RGB curves node. So if we just hover that over this connecting line, it's going to automatically connect it for us. And basically what this is going to allow us to do is really crunch the noise texture in and make it look. So I usually like to just crunch it down here, and it basically gives it that warping effect. Something like that usually looks pretty good, so I'm just going to leave it as that for now. So you can kind of see it stretching the reflection. In my opinion, that looks more like a can already. So before we continue, there is still a couple more things that we can do to really elevate this thing. So firstly what I'm going to do is add in some fingerprints. So I've just drag and dropped the fingerprint texture in here. If I Control Shift and click it, you can see it's basically just a bunch of fingerprints here. So now to mix these two together into the roughness of the can, I'm going to add in a Mix RGB shader. So you just Shift A, type in mix RGB. It says top one here. You can just basically connect the two, and you'll see immediately there's a little bit more realism on the can. So it's currently displaying fingerprints as well. Depending on how much fingerprints you want on this can, I mean, you can make it as a factor of 1 to have only the fingerprints enabled, and I mean that looks pretty unrealistic, so I'm just going to switch it back to 0.5, and I'm just going to change the factor here to add, and basically that's just going to change the way it's interpolating. It's going to make the fingerprints texture additive. So before we continue, there's one more thing that I'd like to add here. So the final thing I'm going to add to this texture is some smudging. So in the assets provided, there should be a smudges large overlay. So I'm just going to drag that in. And then from here, I'm just going to connect that up to the specular. So with that added in, it basically gives another layer of detail. I'm actually going to add in an invert node. What that is going to do, it's going to invert the color and basically change the way this looks. Feel free to not include this part. If you don't like this rough, dirty look of the can, more than free to just take all of this and delete it. Or you can even just select it all and press M on your keyboard to mute it, and then play around with the texture yourself and change it as you would like. I find that this makes it a little bit more dynamic. Okay, final thing we can do here is we can actually add in an HDRI to our scene, and that's basically going to give us real world lighting. So you've come over here to the world tab. You can actually click on the background, hit Ctrl T, and that's going to load up this environment texture for you. And from there you can just open up the environment texture Photo Studio 1, and that'll change the entire lighting of the scene. Okay, so I've just loaded that in now, and nothing has changed yet because we haven't actually moved over to the rendered view. So what I'm going to do is press Z on my keyboard, come up here to rendered. So now we have real world lighting to go with our Red Bull can, which is pretty cool. So you can see all of the reflections are interacting dynamically, and it's looking pretty awesome. So from here, we're going to move on to creating the lighting setup, creating the infinite backdrop for the Red Bull cans to sit on, and then also starting on the product animation side of things. Alright, so now that we've got our Red Bull can created and ready for rendering and animation, we're going to move over back to the layout section here and basically set up our scene with lights and a camera and of course a backdrop for the product to sit on. So let's begin with a very simple backdrop. I'm going to go Shift A, Mesh and Plane. I'm just going to scale this up by 8, so I'm just going to press S and then 8. And then from here, I'm going to jump into the edit mode. I'm just going to select the edge on the back here and extrude it up on the Z axis. And then the edge just here in the center, I'm going to press Ctrl B and basically give this a bit of an infinite backdrop rolling up on the mouse wheel. So something like that looks pretty good. You can see we've got these weird faceted edges. So all you have to do is just right click, shade smooth. And there we go, we have the very basic photo backdrop for our Red Bull can. I'm just going to scale this up a bit more so it's a little bit larger and encompasses a bit more space so that the camera doesn't catch the background. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm actually going to create a secondary window here so that we can see the camera view and work whilst we're working on the scene. So if you come up to the top here, you can just drag across another scene, like so. So now we can work out of this scene and actually have the camera focused on in this scene. So speaking of the camera, let's actually add that back in. So I'm going to go Shift A, Camera, and then in this side of things I'm going to press 0 to jump to the camera view. So now that we've got the camera selected and we're seeing here in the camera view, we can pull this up and start playing around with how it's actually viewing the product. If you want a very quick and easy way to play with the camera and move it to the exact position that you want, in this view you can hit N on your keyboard. This is going to bring up a new menu where you can basically come down to the View tab and you can do Camera to View. So what that is going to do is while you're looking through the camera, you can actually move it with the way that you're looking at the viewport. So I'm just going to line this up roughly something like this. And just so that I don't have the distraction of the outside of the camera, I've got to come down to the camera settings and change the viewport display. This parser part out is basically just going to disable everything outside of the view. So if it's at 0, you'll see everything, and if it's at 1, you'll see nothing. So I'm just going to leave it at 1. So with all of that done, I'm just going to, before I do anything, I'm going to change this from camera to view. I'm going to switch that off so that now I don't accidentally mess up my shot. And now we can actually start lighting this thing and seeing it in real time here. So let's change this over to rendered view. And let's move the can to be viewing the camera. There we go. Alright, so now let's add in some point lights and really make this scene stand out a bit more. So I'm just going to go Shift A, light, point. I'm going to bring this up here and basically just position it in a way that gives off a few reflections to the can. So if we go over to the light properties here, we can play with the power and we can increase that just a bit. So 100, you can see it's starting to give that reflection on the Red Bull can. I might start off with 300, bring it off to the side here, something like that. And then I'm also going to increase the radius. So something like 1 meter seems pretty good. There we go. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate this and put it behind the can as well. So Shift D, bring that behind the can here. I'm just going to push it up against the wall, and I'm going to increase the radius to something fairly large, and also increase the power to something like 500. There we go. So already that's looking pretty good. But what I do want to do quickly is just change the texture of the backdrop here. So if we go over to the shading editor and we hit new, I'm basically just going to make this a black backdrop. There we go. So immediately that's giving it a bit more of a dynamic look. I do, however, want to change the roughness. So I'm just going to push the roughness up a bit to something like 0.7. So now we have a little bit more of a dynamic look on the Red Bull can. And I'm just going to decrease the specular ever so slightly to something like 0.3. 0.35 seems pretty good. So now if we go back to the layout here, we can start playing with the lights a bit more and sort of cater it to this new backdrop that we've created. So straight away, this big light behind the can isn't really doing anything. So I'm just going to increase the power to something like 1000. Immediately that's looking a lot nicer. And I think just quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale everything down a little bit. So I'm going to press A on everything, hit S to scale. And just quickly, I've noticed that the scale is a little bit off here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press A to select everything. So I'm just going to hit S to scale, and I'm going to press 0.5 on the numpad and hit enter. So now everything is scaled a little bit more appropriately. I'm just going to hit A for everything again, and then I'm going to press Ctrl A to apply the scale. Alright, now with that out of the way, we can continue on with the lighting. So for this backlight here, it's a little too big, so I'm just going to change the radius down to something a little more convenient like this. 1 meter seems pretty good. And then for the power, I think 1000 still looks reasonable, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. Now for your scene and the other scenes that we're going to create, the lighting will change depending on the shot. So this isn't set in stone, we can always change it on the fly, but this is just the look that we're going with. So now that all of that is out of the way, we can actually jump into the product animation side of things now, and then move on to the product rendering and all of that juicy good stuff. So let's start off by setting up our can here to actually be ready for product animation. So first things first, all of these objects here, they're actually disconnected. So what we want to do is basically join this all up so it's one single object. Easiest way to do that is if you just select everything here. So let's select the little pin, the tab here, and also the lid, and then finally the can. Once all of that's selected, you can hit Control and J, and what that is going to do is basically add it all together as one object. When we move this around, it's going to all move together. Whereas before, if we moved it all around, it would not come with us. Alright, so now that we've got the can all set up, we can actually start moving on to the product animation, which is going to be done using an empty object to control all of the keyframe data and things like that. So before we create the empty, I'm just going to set the origin of the can. So if you right click it, set origin to geometry. That's just going to make the can's origin a little bit more precise. And now what I'm going to do is add in an empty object to control the can. So if we go Shift A, empty, I'm going to use a cube. What we can do now is just bring this up and basically align it to the can. There we go, something like that. So now all of the movement that happens with the can, we want this to happen when we are moving the empty object. So the very easy way to do that is just simply parenting this object to this object. So if we click the can, shift click the empty, and then we hit Control P, we can set the parent to object. So now when we start moving this empty object, the can's actually going to follow what the empty object is doing. So what I'm going to do now is just bring up the timeline here so we've got a little bit more space to work in. And with the can and the empty selected, I'm just going to duplicate this twice. So Shift D to create one extra can, and then Shift D to create another extra can. So now we have 3 cans to start playing around with. So first off, let's actually name these empties so that we know what they are. So empty 1, let's just call this, let's hit F2 and call this can underscore 1. For empty number 2, let's just hit, for the second empty, let's hit F2, call this can underscore 2. And then the fourth empty, let's hit F2 and call this can underscore 3. So now we have can 1, 2, and 3. So what we want to do is basically, in this timeline, we're going to create keyframes at specific spots to create the animation. So now we're going to make that dynamic shot of the camera zooming out and rotating, and having the cans also move around and rotate and do some cool stuff. So to begin with, let's first off select the time range of our timeline. So over here we can choose how long we want this animation to go for. So let's just say that this is a 24 frame per second animation. I'm just going to type in here 24 times 5. So that's going to make 5 seconds of animation, which is 120 frames. So if we want this to be a 5-second animation, we can just simply type in here 120, and that's going to reduce the timeline to 120 frames. For me, however, I want this to be a little bit more snappy, so I'm going to change this to 24 times 3. So it's just going to be a 3-second animation for this introductory shot. So let's make that 72. And now we can actually start playing with the animation and creating that cool dynamic shot. So let's move the playhead back to frame 0. And what I'm going to do is actually click on the camera and then come down here to this little dot, which is auto keying. So if we click that, we've now got auto keying enabled, which means anything we do at all, let's say for example I'm going to move the camera into the Red Bull logo, you can see down here it's created a keyframe. So if we move back to frame 72 and I bring this out to reveal the cans, you can see we've now got this sweet animation, and we didn't have to click any keyframes in or do anything. It's just automatically done it for us, which is pretty awesome. So I'm just going to, before I continue with the camera's animation, I'm just going to delete these 2 keyframes, and I'm going to adjust the camera settings. So first off, I can see it's already on a slight angle, so I'm just going to level out this rotation here to 90, like so, and I'm going to level these 2 out as well. So I'm going to change Y to 0, and also Z I'm going to change to 0 for the rotation. For the location, I'm just going to leave it as is because we're going to be animating that on the fly. So now I'm just going to push this in to be front and center with the Red Bull can. I'm just going to move it over a slight bit. And you can see the depth of field is a little bit intense here. So I'm just going to change that out here. So I'm just going to turn that off for now, and if it feels like it needs it at any given point, I'll turn it back on and play with the settings then and really refine it. But for now, we're just focusing on the actual animation. So to begin with, we've got it starting at frame 0. We're just going to move it over to frame 72, pull the camera out to reveal the cans, and you can see that's created the animation for us here. But we do want to have the camera rotating 360 degrees. So the easiest way to do that is just to come over here to frame 72. You can actually jump through each keyframe by pressing up and down on your arrow keys. So frame 72, I'm going to come up here to the camera's object properties, and we're just going to change the rotation of the y-axis 360 degrees. So just type in 360, and now you'll see it's got that dynamic rotation shot here. I'm seeing in the animation, however, there's that tiny gap where you can actually see below the plane here. So I'm just going to select it, and I'm going to move this edge out beyond the camera's view. That way it's not going to pick it up in the final animation. There we go. So very dynamic shot, but it's very bland and very slow. So I'll show you shortly how to fix that in the graph editor. But for now, let's actually create the Red Bull can animation. So for can 1, I'm just going to select that. I'm going to go back to frame 0. We're going to press G and click, left click, and that's going to create a keyframe here. And then I'm just going to go all the way back to frame 72, and I'm going to pull it forward slightly like that. So now we've got the can pushing out, and for these two cans, they're going to fly out from behind the can and create that dynamic shot. So back to frame 0, I'm going to select can 2 and press G to create a keyframe. Then I'm going to go to frame 72. And what I'm going to do is just move it across outside of the other can so it comes into view. And a quick way to actually make this symmetrical is you can hold down Control while moving, and you can see it snapping to the grid. I'm just going to move it across 1.5 meters. And then for can 3, basically we're going to do the same thing. Back to frame 0 here. I'm going to press G and create a keyframe for it. Then I'm going to go back to frame 72. And I'm just going to move it across 1.5 meters in the X axis. So now we can see this is what the animation is looking like at the moment. But we actually want these cans to be spinning as they shoot out from the back. So for these two guys on frame 72, we're just going to rotate it on the Z axis, like so. So for this guy, I'm just going to make it negative 360. And then for this one here, I'm going to make it positive 360 rotation. So now you'll see they're slowly rotating out as they come out of view from behind the can, which is pretty cool. And I'm just noticing now I don't actually want them all looking directly at the camera with the same rotation. I actually want these two at the back to be slightly off, so it's not so symmetrical and there's a little bit of asymmetry in there. So for this one, I'm just going to rotate it slightly out like so. And then this one here, again, a little bit more. Just like that. So now we have this playing as the animation. You can see as we're playing the animation, it's very slow, and also there isn't a lot of easing in or easing out. It's just very linear. And that's because currently everything, if we select everything and we select these two keyframes, you can hit T on your keyboard and you can see the interpolation, it's not actually set to anything. So it's just using the default, which is linear. So what we can do is we can change this over to Bezier, and immediately it's going to be looking a little bit better, but we can obviously improve this a heck of a lot. So what I'm going to do is just down here in the timeline, I'm just going to come over here and change over to the graph editor. If you want a quick way to switch between these two screens, you can hit Shift F6 to go to the graph editor and Shift F12 to go to the timeline. So now that we're in the graph editor, I'm just going to select the camera to start with, as well as these three empties. So can 1, can 2, can 3, and you'll see all of their keyframe data is now selected in the graph editor. So with all of that selected, you can hit the period key on your numpad, and that's going to shrink everything down to view. So now with everything selected, what we can do is we can scale the curve to make it really stand out when it's animating. And you'll see in a second what I mean. So if we try to scale it now, it's not going to work as intended. You can see it's doing a lot of weird and wacky things. But if we come over to the pivot point here, we can change this to individual centers. So now instead of it doing that weird stuff, we can actually just scale it in like so, and it's going to scale relative to the pivot point of the keyframe. So I don't know if you can see yet, but what I'm doing now is I'm scaling in, and it's basically squishing the curve together and creating the ease in and ease out effect, but it's just amplifying that. So you'll see when I hit play, it's really dramatically changed how fast it's going to go through that middle part of the animation. It's almost too much right now, so I'm just going to decrease it slightly, and you can see already that's made a heck of a lot better animation so far. So now it's basically just a matter of refining this till something that you enjoy. So I generally tend to play around with the curves quite a bit just until I get something that suits the client's needs. For the camera, I'm just going to come back now and enable depth of field. And I'm going to play with how much depth it has. So you can see if we really crunch that down to 0.1, it's going to create that super dynamic look, but it's kind of inhibiting the product. So I'm just going to pull that out to something like 0.7. I'm just going to see how that looks. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I might even bring it up to 1 meter and we'll go with that. So this is looking pretty good so far. That's basically shot 1 complete. What I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to create that extra little twist at the end. So to do so, we're going to need some more frames to animate with. So I'm just going to bump this up to 120. Don't think we're going to need all of that frame animation. I'm just going to pull this to frame 92, and I'm going to animate the camera zooming out just a tad bit more and also rotating just a tad bit more for that dynamic look. So now when we play this animation, it's going to look something like this. So just looking at this, I may even bring the animation playhead back just a tad bit more to something like frame 85. So let's go to frame 85 here. And let's just select this keyframe and move it across to frame 85. Give that a little preview. And that's looking a lot more dynamic already. So last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to go back into the graph editor, and I'm going to crunch these keyframes down a little bit more. Something like that. And that's looking pretty good. Alright, so now moving on to shot 2 of the product animation. What we can do to really quickly copy this scene and create different keyframe data and animations is we can come up over here to the scene, and you can click this button here, new scene, and it's basically going to create a copy. So if you click that, we can just do full copy, and now that's going to copy absolutely everything from that previous scene that we just created. So now that we have a completely new scene, let's just start off by renaming it. So we can call this shot 2, and we can call this one here shot 1. So a good thing to note is that everything material wise is going to be linked. So for instance, if I change the material of the background to something like white, and we switch over to shot 1, you'll see it's stayed the same. So what we're going to need to do is make separate materials for each scene, if we are changing them at least. So for shot 2, we're just going to keep basically everything the same, so we don't need to worry about that. But what we are going to do is basically going to create an array of cans that's going to form a floor, and then we're going to animate some cans rolling over the top of it. So let's just start by first off going over to our layout section here, and I'm just going to select everything, go back to frame 0, I'm going to delete all of their keyframes. So now with that done, what we can do is I'm just going to grab can 3 and can 2. I'm just going to open them up here. Basically, we're just going to delete all of this. So we've only got one can here. So with this can selected, I'm just going to create an array modifier of the can. So we come over here to the modifier tab, come over to add modifier and click array. What we can do is we can increase the count to something that we need. So you can see it basically goes on forever if we however many cans we want to add in. But I'm first off noticing that the rotation is incorrect. So I'm just going to press Alt and R, and that's going to fix the rotation for us. And I'm also seeing that they're basically touching each other in the center there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the relative offset factor. So if we just increase this just a tad, something like 0.06, Now we can see we've got those cool gaps. So before we continue, I'm just going to set up the camera and make sure that it's actually looking down from a top view onto all of the cans that we're going to create. So with the camera selected, I'm just going to rotate it. I'm just going to press Alt-R to reset its rotation. I'm going to bring that up like so. And now I'm just going to rotate it on the Z-axis, -90 degrees. And now we've basically got a little playground for us to set up our cans in. So with the can selected, I'm just from the camera's perspective, setting this up. So just about there seems good. And now back to the modifier tab for the can. I'm going to increase the count to 5. Looks like that encompasses everything. And then, because we need it to go this way as well, I'm just going to duplicate the array modifier. So you can just come here to the tab, the drop down tab, or you can just hit Shift D. That's going to duplicate it. And now with array, the second array, we can change the factor to a different axis. So you'll see immediately this is what we're looking for, -y. So I'll just go -1, -1.06. There we go. And for the count, I'm just going to increase this until it encompasses the camera's view. So it looks like 10 seems pretty good. So now that we've got the cans down pat, you can see immediately we've got a bit of repetition going on with the cans tabs. So we need to basically rotate each one individually. But if we try to do that right now, you'll see it's doing everything at once. And that's because we're still in a non-destructive workflow and we're using the array modifiers still. So to do so, we're just going to apply these array modifiers that we've created. So if we come down here, you can just click on apply, or you can just hit Control A, and that's going to apply it. So now that we've got this applied, it's still its own one object. And to fix that, all we need to do is go into edit mode and separate the cans. If you go into edit mode, select everything, hit P, and then do separate by loose parts. You'll see now that everything is separated into its own individual can. The only issue here is that it's even separated the top of the lid as well as the tab and the nail. So basically all we need to do now is rotate all the tops of the lids and make them feel like they haven't just been copy pasted like they have been. So first off, we need to change the origin point because, as you can see, it's currently still at the origin point of the original can. So if you just hit A on your keyboard to select everything, you can right click and then go set origin to geometry. So now we can come in, we can select each of these here, we can hit R and Z, and we can basically just rotate it. You'll see it's updating in the camera's view to look a little bit more realistic. So I'm just going to speed through this now and I'll see you after that. Alright, so now we've got all the cans roughly rotated and they all look basically like they've been randomly placed there now. So now we can move on to the animation side of this and basically create the empty that's going to roll over this view and have all those cans rolling with it. So let's start off with first off creating a can for us to animate. So I'm just going to grab these three guys here. I'm going to Control J them so that they're all one object. And then I'm going to Shift D and bring that up above the cans. Awesome. So you can see it's still parented. So I'm just going to Alt P and clear the parent. So now that it's got no parent objects, we basically just need to create a new empty for it to use. So I'm going to go empty. I'm going to go with cube and just bring that up and basically scale it to size. Awesome. So now let's just parent this one. So click the can, Shift P, click that, and set parent to object. Now basically what we're going to do is I'm just going to rotate it so that it's on its side here like this. I'm basically just going to push the can across the screen. So as you can see, when I'm trying to move it on the axes, it's not following the local axis of the empty object. So a quick way to fix that is you can just hit G and then double tap the axis that you want it to be following. So for instance, if we go G and then hit Z, that's using the global axis. If we hit Z again, it's going to use the axes of the empty object, which is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do here is just going to line it up like so. And then for frame 0, I'm just going to move it off screen a little bit more. So I'm just moving it on the Y axis. And then I'm just going to move over to frame 72. Just going to quickly change the timelines frames to 72. And now I'm just going to animate this basically moving across the screen, and then I'll animate in the rolling. So on frame 72, I'm just going to move this like so. And I'm going to do my best to make sure that it lines up so that it's starting at here and ending here as well. So something like this. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that'll do. So now we're basically needing to animate the rolling of the can. So this is where the empty object comes in handy. We basically need the empty to be rotating to show that it's rolling, but try and do the rotating on the Z axis, which is where we would need it to be rotating. You'll see when we actually play, it's doing some really weird interpolation, and that's obviously not how a Rebel can would roll across the top of this. So what we need to do is actually just animate the can itself. So if we just hit R and then Z twice, let's just do 360 degrees of rotation. You'll see now the can is actually rotating, but it's also following the form of the empty object as well. So that's pretty cool. Obviously we need to increase the amount of rotations it has, so let's just go R, Z. I'm hitting Z twice to do its local rotation. Let's do 720 rotation here. And you can see already that looks way better. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a few more rotations. So I'm just doing 360 times 3, so 1080 for the rotation, and that looks much better. And now we basically just need to duplicate this a couple times to create that sort of array of rotating cans across the top. So let's grab the empty and the can. I'm just going to do Shift D. And now at the beginning and the end, we need to just move them slightly away from one another. So in frame 0, I'm just going to move this duplicated can across now. Like that. And then on frame 72, we basically need to do the same thing. So I'm just moving it across on the x-axis, and then I'm going to change to the local axis by hitting Z twice. So G to move, press Z twice, and now I'm moving on their local axis. And now if we hit play, you'll see we've got two cans rolling across the screen. Pretty cool. Obviously we're going to need to offset the rotation because this one, they're basically doing it in uniform, which looks kind of weird. So what we can do to do that is, if we hit this one here, we can change their initial rotation. So instead of the first can starting at 0 rotation, I've just changed it to -180. And you'll see it's definitely offset it, but we need to also offset the end frame. So basically it'll just be 1080 minus 180, so that's where it'll stop. And now they'll be rotating at the same pace, but they've got a different offset, and it looks a lot more natural. So now I'm just going to speed through this and do that again for a bunch of cans, and I'll see you once I've finished up that. So I've made this array of Red Bull cans now, and you can see it's looking pretty cool. Basically, yeah, I've just changed their rotation so that they're all offset, so you can see at no given point are there any that are really symmetrical. Apart from maybe these last two, I'll just quickly update that one. So 49.9. There we go. So we've got a really cool dynamic shot to elevate this secondary shot of our sequence here. The only thing I'm seeing here is that it feels a little bit too slow. So let's just change the frames of our animation here. So let's just go with a 2-second shot here, so 48 frames. And quickest way to change that is basically just select everything and grab the keyframe here and just push it down to frame 48. So now instead of it being kind of slow, now it's going a lot faster. I may even just play with this a little bit more and change it out to something like frame 60. It was just dragging on a little too long, I felt like, for that 72 frame shot. That's looking pretty good, so I think I'm just going to leave it there, and we can now move on to shot 3. Okay, so now we're on to shot 3, and there's only 2 more shots left in this sequence, so we're just going to sort of fly through these last 2. So again, we're just going to come up here, let's go shot 1, and we're going to just create another full copy. So just hit full copy here, and let's just rename this to shot 3. Alright, there we go. So now we're basically just going to clean up this scene again. So hit A for everything, to select everything. Just going to delete all these keyframes here. And then we're just going to start setting up the scene. So first off, the camera, just going to move it up to somewhere like here. That seems good. And now for the cans, basically we're going to have a dynamic shot where 3 of them are sort of slowly rotating in front of the camera, showing off the can's design. So for this first can, I'm just going to push it over here. For the second can, I'm going to pull it up like so, have it kind of behind it like that. Then the third can, it's just going to be also behind the first can. And now we're just basically going to get into rotating these guys. I'm going to have them sort of on an angle, but to start with, we're just going to rotate them into the position that they should be in. So something like this seems good. I'm just going to pull it off into frame a little bit more, like that. There we go. And for this one, I'm just going to make it another 72 frame shot. So for the camera's depth of field, it's a little too much right now, so I may just push it back ever so slightly. Alright, I even might just... I'm just going to turn it off the focus object really quickly, and I'm just going to change it over to this one here. So that's focusing on the subject in the front, and the 2 at the back are a little bit out of focus, as you can see. So it might just go something like 0.8, seems pretty good. And now I'm just going to continue working on the shot and moving them into position. Something like this seems pretty good, so now I'm just going to select all 3 of them, all 3 empties, and I'm going to rotate them on the y-axis so that they sort of make this cool uniform view. So this is basically where I want the shot to begin. What I'm going for here is I want each of them to be in frame. I don't want any of them out of frame. They're getting very close to being out of frame, but they're slowly going to be rotating up. So how they're set up now is totally fine. And now it's just a matter of animating to frame 72 and having them slowly move upwards. So G, Z twice, so they're on their local axis. We're going to go up like so. And I'm actually going to dynamically change how far they go up each. So for the first one, I'm going to actually have him down a little bit further, so something like that. For the one at the back, that one's going to go up the most, so I'm just going to pull it up a tiny bit more. And then the one in the middle, I'm just going to bring it down a little bit. And right now, that is how the shot is looking so far. So now I'm just going to keep playing with the animation. So this bottle in the front, I'm just going to push it up just a tad bit more. I'm also going to select all the keyframes here. So select everything, select all the keyframes. I'm actually going to make this one linear. So that way it's always in constant motion and there's no easing in or easing out. Alright, so now that we've got that down pat, I'm just going to again select everything, go to frame 0. And now for the cans themselves, we can actually employ the same method that we did on the previous shot, whereas we can make individual animations for the cans whilst they're following the animation of the empty object. So this way we don't get that really weird interpolation of the rotations. So for can 1, I'm going to, on frame 0, start off like this. So I'm just pressing Z twice so it's on the local axis. And then at frame 72, I'm going to have it fully reveal. Awesome. Now for this can in the back, again, just going to do R and Z twice, like so. And then at frame 72, it's going to fully reveal itself like that. And then finally, this last can, I'm going to press R and left click to put in a keyframe. And then at frame 72, I'm just going to let it reveal itself at the back there. So immediately I can see, I think we need a little bit more movement in the front. So what I'm going to do is just rotate this a little bit more, like so. I'm actually going to have it start off a little bit more towards the back like so. And then on frame 72, I'm just going to move it slightly more like so. And now they're all kind of moving relatively at the same speed. And whilst I'm looking at this, I think they all need to move up just a tad bit more. So I'm going to go G and press Z twice, push that up, and now we've got a pretty dynamic shot there. Now for lighting this one, we can definitely play around with the lights. We may just go back and revisit the lighting for each scene as we're rendering it, but for now let's just quickly play with the lights. So at frame 0, I want this light to be here. And then at frame 72, I kind of want it to float above the cans and across them as well, like this. Let's see how that looks in motion. I may even just make it go straight up. Just like that. Looks pretty good. Might just keep it as that. So I'll keep that light in the back as is. And then finally, I'm just going to test an area light just at the front, like so. Just to see how this looks in motion, I'll just bump that up to 300. Yeah, that's looking much better. So I think that suits it pretty well. I'm just going to make that instead of the shape being square, I'm just going to make it an ellipse. And I'm just going to move it off a little bit to the side here, like so. And there we go, that's shot 3 completed. Alright, so now for the final shot of this sequence, it's going to be that shot of the can swiping across screen and revealing the company's slogan or tagline. So what we're going to do is basically create another new scene. So let's go to shot 1, we'll just copy this one again. So new scene, full copy, we'll just call this shot 4. And again, we're just going to copy everything over. So A to select everything, delete all of the keyframes. And now let's get to work on setting up this shot. So it's a very simple and quick and easy shot. So we'll just bring the camera back out here. That looks pretty nice. And then what we're going to do is basically delete these 2 cans, as there's only going to be 1 can on screen. Now for the empty, I'm going to move it out of shot, which will make a nice little keyframe for us. And basically we're going to have it swipe onto frame like so. And then here in the empty space is where there's going to be the slogan of the company. So I'll move it all the way over here. I may even just have it floating a little bit like like that. And right now this is how it's looking. Very slow, very basic animation. Here I'm just going to change the rotation of the can. So we're going to have it like so, and then it'll slowly rotate on screen. And then for the final remainder of its on-screen performance, we're going to very slowly keep it rotating like so. And now that is basically the shot complete, but we can play with all of the curves and keyframes just to make it stand out. So first off, I'm just going to change this to Bezier. And straight away that's looking much nicer. But if we go into the graph editor, so Shift F6, so let's just select all the keyframes, hit the period key on your numpad so it zooms in, and now let's play with the curve and find something that suits our scene. So I've just scaled it in a fair amount here. That's looking pretty good. I want it to be more snappy though, so I'm just going to play with it even more and make it a really tight crunch here on the curve. So that's super dramatic. I don't think we're going to go with that. But you can see here at the apex of the curve, it's almost flatlining at the top. So I'll just play with it, bring it down slightly. And that's looking pretty good there. I'm noticing that at the very end of its lifespan, it's just completely stopping. To fix that, it's just as easy as playing with the curve here on this individual keyframe. There we go. And that's basically the shot. It's looking amazing right now. Again, we can play with the lighting. So if we maybe don't want this intense light at the back and we maybe just want it at the back of the can, we can move it there. We could even just create new lights completely and change how they look. But for now, this is the shot, and we'll do all the compositing of the slogan in DaVinci Resolve once we've rendered everything out. So with all that said, let's go back to shot 1. We're actually now just going to set up our render settings and then move on to compositing and finishing everything up in DaVinci Resolve. Alright, so for shot number 1, I think that the lighting here is fine. We can leave it as is. It does the trick, does the job, and it's looking fairly dynamic as is. So I'm fairly happy with it there. So all we really need to do now is set up our compositing settings to make this shot really stand out, and then also move on to rendering and setting up all of the final render settings of our scenes. So first up, let's actually create a test render. So if we go over to the render properties tab here, and if we hit F12, that's going to create our test render for us. So straight away I can see we do actually need to do some work on the lights here, but now we can move over to the compositing workspace. So if we just close out of this and come up here to the compositing workspace, we can start making some changes here to make this thing really stand out and pop on screen. So if we come up to use nodes, we'll be able to see that we've got a couple nodes here that can help us start compositing a couple things in. So first off, we need to create a viewer node so we can see what we're doing. So if you hit Control Shift and click on the render layers, you'll see that we now have the viewer node here. I'm just going to move that across to there. And right now the image is super zoomed in. So to zoom out, you can just hit V on your keyboard. That'll zoom it out. If you want to zoom back in, you can hit Alt V. That'll zoom you in. But let's just leave it as that for now. So very quickly, I'm just going to add in a lens distortion node. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to enable chromatic aberration for us. So if I change this dispersion here to something like 0.5, you'll see we've got these crazy chromatic aberrations around the sides of the bottle. We obviously don't need it to be that extreme, so I'm just going to change it to something like 0.025. That's not quite enough for my liking, so I'm just going to change this to something like 0.05. There we go, and now you can see there's some very slight chromatic aberration happening at the back here. So that's definitely going to elevate the final shot once we get there. Right now we're only viewing this, however, so we need to add this to the composite node. So if we move that over to there, it's not going to actually appear in our final renders. Great, so now that that's all set up, we can move back to the layout and we can fix up the lighting here and make it a little bit more dynamic. So first things first, I think we need to add in a light here at the front, an area light. So I'm just going to move that up, bring it in front here, and have it basically pointing at all three of them, like so. And we're basically going to do the same as before. We're going to change this to something like 300. Not too bad. Maybe we'll go 250, a little bit less intense. I'm going to change this to an ellipse instead of a square. And now from here, I'm just going to give another quick test render and see how that's looking. Alright, that's looking pretty nice. What I might do just quickly is I'm actually going to change the focal length of the camera. I'd like it to have a little bit more of perspective to it. So something like, let's go with 85. That's looking a lot nicer. So with that change of focal length, I'm just going to adjust some of the keyframes I've created. There we go. That's looking pretty nice already. And as you can see from the test renders here, it's looking not too bad at all. I'm just going to quickly change one thing for the material of this Red Bull can. I'm seeing from this view here, it's not as metallic as I'd like it to be. So I'm just going to go over to the shading tab and quickly on the Red Bull can texture, making sure that I'm on it here. I'm just going to change this from specular and just unplug that and see if that elevates the shot at all. Alrighty, and I'm also just seeing here on the fingerprints texture, I'm just going to move it from slot 2 to slot 1. Alright, that's looking much better. I'm just going to close this off now. And I'm just going to change the material on the backdrop one more time. And actually just decrease the roughness just slightly to something around 0.6. Awesome. Okay, so now we're ready to start rendering and lock in those final render settings. So if we come back to layout here, come across to the render settings, all we really need to enable right now is ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, and motion blur, which should already be enabled. We can check on depth of field and change this a little bit if we want to, but for right now, the depth of field that we have on the camera is doing all of the work for us. If we want to change a little bit more of the look, we can. So if we don't want a very high contrast look, we can change that to very low contrast. This part's totally up to you. I enjoy the look of the high contrast, and you can also change the exposure as well as the gamma. I'm going to leave it as is, but it's there if you want to play around with it. So lastly, we just need to set up the render output and the resolution and dimensions of our first shot. So first up, it's going to put the images that you're rendering into a temporary folder on your hard drive. I recommend finding a folder that works for you, something easily accessible, as we're going to be compositing all of this in DaVinci Resolve. I've just created a folder for it to output all the images to, just named it Shot 1. So from here, you can decide how you want to actually render this out. So if you want to render it as an image sequence, which I highly recommend, you can just leave it as is. You can leave it as file format PNG, leave all of this stuff down here, and as long as the resolution is as you wish, we're all good to go. So we're going to be rendering from frame 1 and then ending at frame 85. And then the frame rate is 24 frames per second. And to render your animation, you can either come up here to render and hit render animation, or you can hit Control F12 and that will start the rendering process. So I'm going to hit Control F12 and render this out now. There we go, so the scene has finished rendering. Now what we can do for the final composite in DaVinci Resolve, to get that change in backdrop where it zooms out here, it's very simple. All we need to do is change the material here of the backdrop. So if we go to shading, we'll just change the material to white. Something like that. And now we just need to find the frame where it starts to zoom backwards. So here seems good, 74. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the timeline to 74 and to start at frame 74 and end at frame 85. And we're just going to render these frames out again. And instead of the black backdrop being there, it's going to automatically, once we composite everything and bring it into DaVinci Resolve, it'll automatically make that transition for us. So if you hit Control F12, that'll render out and we can continue on to shot 2. Alright, so that's completed its rendering process. So now I'm just going to move over to shot 2 up here in the scenes. And we're basically going to do that whole process again. So for compositing, fortunately it hasn't copied across the composite nodes for us. So what we can do is come up here to shot 1. And if we just copy a box like this, Control C to copy that, come back over to shot 2. And as long as we have used nodes enabled up here, we can just Control V and paste it in here, and it's basically just copied it all across for us. So now if we go back to our layout here, check out our scene. Right now it's looking okay. It's also copied across the white backdrop, so I'm just going to quickly change that back to the black backdrop in the shading section, like so. So it's looking good, but I think we could use a bit more light in the scene. So first thing I want to do is bring this light above the cans, like so. And I kind of want it to animate across the scene with the cans, kind of like this. So already, I mean, that's looking much more dynamic. I'm just going to bring it down a little bit more so it's got a bit more of a dramatic effect to it. That's looking pretty good. And I think that's actually going to be the final setup for the lights for this shot, as it's looking pretty dynamic. And that is the exact same lighting setup that I had for the initial shot that I created. So now it's just a matter of creating the folder for your shot to render out to. And then we can move on to shot 3. Okay, so I've created a new folder for my shot to render out to. All of the settings should have stayed the same. So before we can render this out, we actually have to change the compositing nodes to have this scene as its active scene. So all you need to do is come over to the compositing tab, come down here and change it from shot 1 to shot 2. And now when you render, it will, instead of rendering the previous shot, it's going to render this shot, like so. So now all you have to do is render this out with Control F12 and we're good to go to shot number 3. Alright, so now we can move on to shot number 3 with that out of the way. So let's come up here, change this over to shot 3, and now we can work on the lighting for this scene and polishing up this shot. So first off, let's go to the compositing node and let's just copy in, so hit use nodes, so we can delete these 2 nodes first and then paste in those ones from the previous shot, and then finally just change this over to shot number 3. So now let's come back out to the layout tab, and now we can start polishing the lighting before we actually start rendering this out. So first off, I'm just going to grab this light at the back here and pull it up so it sort of gives it a halo effect around the back here. And for this shot, there's going to be 3 changes of color tone. So the first will be black, then it's going to change to yellow, then red, then blue. So we basically just want to set up the timeline so we'll split it into 4 sections. So for the first 18 frames, it's going to be a black backdrop. So we'll just change this to 18, and we'll come over to our render output settings here, create the output folder, and then we'll render these 18 frames out. So Control F12 to render, and then we'll move on to the other backdrops. Alright, so now we can click on the backdrop here and change the color. So if we go over to the shading tab, let's just bring its color up, and we'll just pick a yellow here to start with. Something like that looks pretty good. So we'll go with that, come back to the layout, And I'm just going to change the start frame from 1 to 18, and we'll end it on frame 36. And now we'll just render out these coming frames. Alrighty, now that's done, we're just going to repeat the process. So back to the shading tab, we'll change this over to more of a red, and we'll come back and we'll change this over to end on frame 54 and start from frame 36. Now we can just hit Ctrl F12 and render these frames out. Alright, and now lastly for the blue backdrop. So back to the shading tab, let's change this over to a blue. Something like that seems pretty good. Now back to the layout, I'm just going to change this from ending from 54, change that to 72, and then we'll make it start on 54. Now all we've got to do is render it out and we're good to go on to shot number 4. Alrighty, so that's all completed now. So that's shot number 3 done. We can move on to shot number 4 now and finish out the process of rendering. So let's go up to scenes here. We'll change over to shot 4. And now that we're here, all we really need to do is repeat what we've done with these last 3 shots. So let's go over to the compositing tab. We'll just hit use nodes. Going to delete these 2 and paste in the ones from the previous scene. And then finally, I'm just going to change this over to be linked to shot number 4. So now that that's done, let's go over to the shading tab and let's change the material here back to a black, like so. And now let's go back to the layout and play with the lighting until it's something that we enjoy. I'm just going to remove this light here at the front as it's just sort of floating there and not doing much. And I am going to add another light in, an area light. I'm going to bring that way in front here, and I'm just going to point it at the can, and I'm also going to increase its power to something like 200, and also change its shape to be an ellipse. Let's increase that power to something a little bit more drastic. I'm also going to make it a little larger by scaling it. It's looking pretty good. I might try, so I'm just going to bring it in a little closer to the can here. I'm just playing around with the power and the settings of this light. So that's looking okay. I think I might even just add another light in, just copying this one, so Shift D to duplicate it. Bring it in fairly close to the Red Bull can. And we're definitely going to diminish its power to something like 200. There we go. That's looking fairly decent. With this area light, I've just scaled it on the Z axis. So I'm just going to press Shift T and aim that more at the can there. And that's looking pretty decent. So what I'm going to do now is just make that output folder again for the frames to render out to. And then from there we can jump into DaVinci Resolve and finish this whole Skillshare course off. And you'll have a sweet product render available to you. Alright, so now with all of that out of the way, we can save our project and move over to DaVinci Resolve and get started on the compositing workflow there. Alright, so we're now here in DaVinci Resolve, and all we have to do now is basically import our shots that we rendered out, layer them in here, and then do a very simple compositing masking technique on that final shot to reveal the logo and slogan of Red Bull. So first up, let's go down here, let's go over to this tab and import those shots that we rendered out. So first up, got shot 1. You can see it's an image sequence, but what DaVinci Resolve does is it condenses it into one clip. So that's super convenient for us. So now I'll just go back to shot 2 here. You can basically just drag and drop them into your media pool. And so we'll just finish up with shot number 3 and then shot 4, drag those in. So now if we go back to the editing workspace, we can just start dragging and dropping all of these in. So shot 1, we'll drag that in to the timeline, push that back to frame 0, and you can see it's kind of small right now because I'm zoomed out quite a bit. So if you just hit Alt and then scroll on your mouse wheel, it'll zoom in and you can actually see what you're working with. So shot 1, move on to shot 2, drag that in there and snap it along, shot 3, and shot 4. So if we play this now, this is what it'll look like. So everything is basically done now. We just need to set up that final reveal here on the last shot, where as the Red Bull can swipes across the screen, we'll have a mask that shows the actual text saying gives you wings. Then apart from that, we can just do some basic color grading. So let's just start off and make this mask here. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the playhead and we're going to go to the frame that we want the text to start revealing itself. So I'm going to say this frame here seems a good place to start. So on this frame, we're going to press B on the keyboard to bring out the blade tool. We're just going to cut it by clicking there. And now we have this clip here in the timeline to actually start editing and putting that mask on. So with this clip selected, you can come down here to the Fusion tab, click on that little magic wand, and now from here we're basically working in a node workspace. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some text and then also a mask. So first up, let's click on this merge node, and we're going to come up here and click on the text. So now with the text selected, we can just start typing in the slogan, which is of course gives you wings. Great, so now we've got the text here. You can just move it across like so, but now we need to add in a mask. So now if you just click on the merge to node, you come up here to these shapes. You can just choose on the rectangle, and that's basically going to create a rectangular shaped mask for you. So you'll see we can move it across the screen and it'll mask out those words for us. So what we want to do is make this an inverted mask. So if you come over here with the rectangle selected, you can click invert, and now we'll be able to keyframe the reveal of these in conjunction with the Red Bull can. So if we bring this playhead back to the first frame, we can come over here to its properties and we can start keyframing the center. As you can see, we can move it like this. So we can start to keyframe that. So on the beginning frame here, I'm just going to move it across like so and keyframe it there. Then I'm just going to start moving through the frames. So next frame, I'm going to move it across a little bit to reveal that, and it's already keyframing this for us. So it's just a matter of, I'm just hovering over here on the timeline, and with my left and right arrow keys, I'm just switching between frames. So next frame, just move it across a little bit more. That's already keyframed. Next frame, a little bit more. And you get the idea. We're basically just revealing the slogan here. So it's going to get to a point soon where it's all completely revealed. And from there, we can just leave it as is and move on. So now if we play this, you'll see if I just deselect that here, we play this now, you'll see it's a pretty smooth and seamless transition. But we can change this a little bit more. So if we come over back to the first frame, we can actually play with the soft edge here and just soften it up a little bit more. That way it's not so much of a hard mask and it's a little bit more pleasing to the eye. So I can see with the rectangle on the first frame, it's still showing a little bit of this. So I'm actually just going to keyframe it. So on the first frame, it's going to have 0 softness. Then the second frame, I'm just going to increase it. Like so. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, let's go back to the editing workspace. So we now have a completed ad here to use. The only thing left that we can do to really spice this up is add a little bit of color grading to the shots. So if we come down here to the color tab, it's going to load up the color workspace, and from here we can just do some basic color correction. So I'm just going to move this out to a part of the shot that's a little bit more dynamic like this, and you can literally just start playing with all of these settings here to sort of boost the image. So we're going to start with the contrast. I'm just going to bring that up a tad bit here. Something like 1.1 seems good. And for the saturation, I'm also going to increase that a little bit. For the gain, I'm just going to use this wheel down here and bring it up just a little bit, just to make it that bit more vibrant. So 1.06 seems pretty good. Now for the gamma, I might just bring that down just a touch. 0.02 seems good. And then the last three things I'm going to change here are the highlight. So if we bring the highlight up a little bit, something like 14.5, and then the shadows as well, I'm just going to bring them up slightly. The final one here is the color boost. I'm just going to go something like 5, seems pretty good. So now this is what it's looking like, which is not too bad. And this is what it was looking like before. So depending on what you want to do here, this is totally optional, totally up to you, but it definitely adds a little bit of flair to your shots. So if you want to, you can also copy and paste the data across each one. So for example, shot 1, I can just Control C here, click on this shot, and then Control V, and that'll copy the data across. Like so. Now to actually finish this off and render this sequence out, all you have to do is come over here to the Deliver tab, and from here, basically we're just going to name the file, make sure it's in the formatting that we would like, so MP4 H.264s, it's got the correct resolution and frame rate, and from here we just name the file to whatever we please. So we're just going to name this Red Bull Ad Skillshare, and then you just choose a location for that to save out to. Great, so once that's done, you basically just need to hit this Add to Render Queue, and from there, down here, you can click Render All, and that will finish off the sequence for you. Alright guys, that's the end of my product rendering masterclass. Thank you so much for watching. Can't wait to see what you guys have created, so please tag me on my socials or leave your project in the projects and resources below.